In this section, we cover the explanation for crises across cultures. When misfortune, mental or physical illnesses, or other types of crises occur, how do societies give explanation for their cause and occurrence? One of the first places where the cause for misfortune and crises is assigned are supernatural forces. That somehow the deities or other forces that are in charge or that have control over the welfare and the well-being of humankind is somehow displeased, maybe punishing individuals or punishing groups for alleged transgressions, but that is very often where the first place people look to place blame. Another reason that gets assigned for misfortune is sorcery. Sorcery is identified as using magic in malevolent ways to harm individuals. And the classic sense, sorcery involves the use of material objects, amulets, potions, other objects to bring about this harm. And that's, in the classical sense again, what distinguishes sorcery from witchcraft. The next area would be spirits, that there are spirits that are somehow have been dishonored, the idea that they have not been respected, usually spirits of the departed. There are ways in which many cultures see a connection between those individuals who have died and passed on, still being very much involved in the lives of individuals who remain on this plane, and they're involved. And when they feel offended, when things happen, they oftentimes will be said to be the cause and bring harm or bring illness or other things to their relatives or to people that are part of their community. Witchcraft is another cause very often assigned for misfortune. We're going to talk about witchcraft a little more in detail, but it is certainly among many, many cultures around the world, one of the first places where blame is placed for misfortune. And then there's a combination of those things. I want to talk a little bit more about witchcraft. Think about it for a moment. Who is most likely to be labeled witches? We know that down through history, there have been witch hunts, witch crazes, other things where people have been identified or called witches, and things that have happened many times. People have lost their lives. It continues to be something that happens in parts of the world. There are countries in Africa where women are labeled witches and they have to separate themselves from community. There's several villages that are devoted to taking in women who were run off from their family and loved ones because of witchcraft accusations. The belief in witchcraft is universal, and women are more often labeled witches than men. It's one thing that tends to happen in a lot of cultures. But what causes a woman or a man to be identified or have the finger pointed at them that they are a witch? Anyone with poor neighbor qualities can be accused. When that person is somehow does not fit in with the rest of the community, they may be labeled a witch. They may not be social. They can separate themselves and be isolated. They might be stingy. They might not be friendly, but things that would cause a person to be identified or labeled as being antisocial, and a poor neighbor in general might cause them to be accused of being a witch. So we've talked about witchcraft accusations, but putting those aside for a moment, there are many cultures in which witches are seen as an integral part of the community. They have a role in which they function. Individuals take on the role of witches. And so the question is, how do they become witches? In some cases, individuals are seen to have their powers passed on to them through inheritance, or that they're God-given. In other places, a person becomes a witch by being an apprentice of an already existing witch. And in some cases, the person who's a witch is drafted. There have been accounts of people who have been, for example, I think of a story of a young girl in a village in Africa who had repeatedly been warned by her parents not to venture off too far from their village, but she did. And one day, while she was out wandering around, a witch came across her path. And in that culture, if a witch came across your path, you were bound to go with them. And in that moment, she had to go with the witch and become her student and became the witch in that community. So the question I want to explore for a moment is witchcraft have more of a positive aspect or negative aspect in a society? Now, the answer might surprise you. So does witchcraft have a more positive or negative societal function? The answer might surprise you, as I said. It actually has a more positive than negative societal function, and this happens in several ways. Oftentimes, a witchcraft accusation or allegation can level economic differences. In places where there is an imbalance in material resources or economic resources, a person who has an abundant amount might be accused of having acquired those through witchcraft. And so what happens is that there's a redistribution of those resources among the people. The person will voluntarily give up some of their resources and distribute them to others in the community to bring themselves back into the fold, if you will, or begin to be seen as not being so anti-social or anti-neighborly. Second way in which witchcraft can have a positive societal function is that it reinforces social values. People know the things that they are to do to avoid being accused of being witches, and so they function in those ways. They are hospitable, they are neighborly, they do share their resources, societal values that are important. And so individuals not wanting to be accused of being witches will maintain this type of behavior. Another way in which witchcraft can have positive societal function is that it's an outlet for hostility. Where there's social tension going on, oftentimes there will be accusations of witchcraft. The community comes together against an individual, and very often because of those tensions that are going on, there will be some things that will happen in forms of rituals and other things, other behavior that ultimately bring some balance to the community. And while at the outset there were hostile interactions, what ends up happening is there's reconciliation and efforts toward peacemaking, and as a result, those individuals can be brought back into balance and the whole community brought back into balance. This is in some cases. In some other unfortunate cases, individuals are run off, as I mentioned. And then finally, there oftentimes is correction made for anxiety and neglect for low status persons. Those individuals, again, who were really kind of on the outside of the community and were accused of witchcraft, as the community seeks to come together and instill some type of balance, that what happens as a result is that person is restored to a better status, and individuals become reticent about their behavior. Some other forces of evil: the evil eye, malicious ghost, spirit possession, attacks by enemy shaman, curses of the envious, the spells of magicians. And when there are other things that happen, misfortune, it can be an index of social strain in a community. It can also help to reduce anxiety, because now you have a reason for why those things occur, as we talked about earlier with the psychological function of religion. There's a cross-cultural belief that demons, spirits, ancestors, and gods all exist as realities in the human mind and can cause harm and harass the living, as I talked about earlier with some of the explanations for crises. As a result, communities will have rituals and other forms of protection to counterbalance the good and evil that is believed to happen, but breaches do occur. The breach that occurs in many communities is possession. The most common entity to possess, usually thought to be demons. And while possession is thought to be harmful, sometimes it can be beneficial in the case of mediums, for example. And the word that we use to talk about what a medium goes through is called atticism, which is the acceptance or seeking out of beneficent spirits by a medium and called upon when needed. There are some functions of possession. They can serve to relieve an individual's intrapsychic tensions and help that person also to gain attention and sympathy. In many ethnologies, we will see people who were outcasts, if you will, or had very low status in the community, oftentimes become possessed, and they gain attention, they gain sympathy of the community. Much like what we talked about earlier about behavior that one engages in to avoid being accused of being a witch, there's also, in many communities, rules that individuals follow to avoid being possessed by demons. So it helps to promote self-discipline and propriety in behavior. So, how does one get rid of an unwanted spirit? There's several techniques that are used to get rid of an unwanted spirit. So how does one get rid of an unwanted spirit? Exorcism is something that many people are familiar with as a result of television and movies, but it is a very real component in many cultures, very real techniques that are used to rid a person who is possessed by an unwanted spirit. Oftentimes using scraping or sponging techniques to get the illness off the body will be used. Reciting magical spells that are thought to drive the possessing entity out. The coaxing out or by singing songs or other incantations closely related to reciting magical spells. Tempting through a meal. Possessing entities very often are thought to have an interest in things human and will come out when foods that they favor or liquor that they favor is offered to them, and they will go in search or seeking out those things once it's known that they're available to them. There are efforts that are very often done to make the patient uncomfortable. This can be in the form of sweat baths, cathartics or emetics, which are ways of making a person become violently ill and they throw up, and as they do so, the possessing entity will leave. Trephining, which, given evidence of human remains that have been found for a very long time, in which a hole is drilled into the skull of an individual that's thought to be possessed by a spirit to allow the spirit out. In cases where people had headaches, this was a common practice in many cultures, including here in the United States, that it would allow the possessing entity to leave. Manipulating or massaging the body, and then finally sucking out the diseased objects, often again with the idea of spirit darts that we will talk about in the context of shamanism, often the belief that sorcerers and other persons causing harm will fire what are called spirit darts into the body of a victim, and by sucking them out is how a person is relieved of their possessing spirit. This concludes our section on the causes of misfortune.